You were never born obedient. You were trained. From your first breath, your brain began absorbing rules, not to make you free, but to make you fit. Fit into a system, fit into a structure, fit into expectations that were never yours. And the scariest part, you didn't even notice it happening, because obedience doesn't start with commands, it starts with conditioning. Every praise, every punishment, every small reward, each one rewired your brain to link safety with submission. When you followed the rules, you were called good. When you questioned them, you were called difficult. That's how it begins. Your nervous system learned that peace isn't freedom, it's compliance. And by the time you grew up, obedience wasn't a choice, it was a reflex. In this video, you'll learn how the world quietly trained your mind to obey, how fear and reward shaped your thoughts before you ever formed them, and how to finally unlearn the invisible programming that runs your life. Because before you can take back control, you have to understand who's really been holding it all along. It started when you were a child. When you were told to sit still, to be quiet, to say sorry, even when you weren't wrong. When you cried and someone said, "Stop it, you're fine." So you learned that expressing pain was unacceptable. When you asked questions that made adults uncomfortable, they called it disrespect. So you stopped asking. At school, you were rewarded for remembering, not for thinking. You were punished for curiosity, but praised for obedience. Your brain adapted fast, because children are survival machines. They'll trade truth for safety every time. Then came society's next phase of conditioning, comparison. You were told that success means pleasing authority, teachers, bosses, systems, gods. The better you followed, the safer you felt. It was never about understanding, it was about approval. You didn't choose to be obedient. You were programmed to associate freedom with danger, to stay within invisible boundaries that someone else drew for you. And as you grew older, you carried those invisible walls inside your mind. Now you don't need anyone to tell you what to do. Your brain does it automatically. That's not discipline. That's conditioning disguised as identity. Your brain didn't learn obedience by choice. It learned it as a form of survival. When you were a child, your mind was open, raw, unguarded, desperate to understand how to stay safe in a world much bigger than you. And in that world, adults were everything. They were safety, approval, and control. When you cried and someone told you to stop, your brain learned that emotion wasn't safe. When you asked questions and were told to be quiet, your brain learned that curiosity leads to disapproval. When you said no and were punished, your brain learned that resistance equals pain. It didn't matter what the words were. What mattered was the feeling that followed. Every sigh, every silence, every disappointed look became a signal that shaped your nervous system. Your body began to associate obedience with love and silence with safety. So you adapted. You started to read faces before speaking. You measured your words by the reactions around you. You became hyper-aware of tension before it even appeared. You learned to adjust, to please, to disappear, not because you were weak, but because it kept you alive. That was the first layer of programming, the link between peace and compliance. You didn't choose it. It was installed in you, one reaction at a time. As you grew, that pattern followed you. You began to confuse calm with belonging. You thought being accepted meant being silent. And without even realizing it, you built your identity around the need to stay safe. You didn't lose your voice, you learned to hide it. And the most dangerous part is that now, even when no one's watching, you still obey. As you grew older, the lessons changed shape, but the system stayed the same. The world stopped telling you to sit still, but it found new ways to keep you in line. Fear and reward, the two leashes of modern obedience. You were told that good people follow the rules, that hard work guarantees success, that failure is personal, not systemic. So you worked harder, stayed quieter, tried to be perfect. And every time you met the standard, the world rewarded you with something small. Approval, praise, a feeling of belonging. That was enough. Enough to keep you chasing the next hit of validation. But when you questioned, when you resisted, when you didn't comply, the same system that called you valuable suddenly called you difficult. You learned that comfort comes from alignment, not authenticity. That's how they programmed your nervous system, one small signal at a time. Your brain became fluent in submission. It learned that the fastest way to avoid pain is to agree, that silence is safer than confrontation, that smiling through exhaustion is easier than rejection. And now every structure, family, religion, school, work, rewards the same thing: quiet compliance. The illusion of choice built on invisible conditioning. You think you're deciding, you think you're free, but your mind is still chasing the oldest instinct it knows: safety. And in a world built to sell peace to the obedient, safety has never been more expensive. By the time you become an adult, the system doesn't need to tell you what to do. You've internalized it. You wake up, check your phone, scroll through the same headlines, and start performing the same rituals. Work, earn, spend, repeat. You call it discipline. But discipline without direction is obedience with a new name. You tell yourself you're making choices, but how many of those choices were planted long before you could question them? The brands you trust, the careers you chase, even the dreams you think are yours. Most of them were handed to you, polished, packaged, and sold as purpose. The truth is simple. You were never asked to think freely. You were trained to think safely. Everything around you reinforces this. The news tells you what to fear. The culture tells you who to admire, the market tells you what to desire, and the algorithm watches quietly, adjusting your reality until it fits the pattern you've already accepted. You're no longer being controlled by force, but by familiarity, by comfort, by the quiet seduction of the known. And every time you feel restless, uncertain, or disconnected, the system offers you something to soothe the discomfort. A screen, a purchase, a distraction. The obedience deepens, not because you're weak, but because you've been conditioned to trade awareness for relief. Freedom isn't taken from you. It's exchanged willingly for the illusion of peace. And the worst part? You think you're in control because you're the one pulling the trigger. But the gun was built for you, long before you ever held it. You were not born obedient. You were born aware, curious, wild. But somewhere along the way, awareness was replaced with conditioning, and freedom was traded for comfort. The good news is that conditioning can be undone. The mind that learned to obey can learn to wake up. It begins the moment you stop reacting automatically, when you pause before saying yes, when you ask yourself, is this choice mine, or was it placed here for me? Freedom doesn't come from breaking rules. It comes from seeing the rules for what they are, systems built to shape your behavior through fear and reward. Start by observing your patterns without judgment. Notice when you apologize for existing. Notice when you shrink to make others comfortable. Every time you become aware, the program loses power. Because awareness is the one thing obedience cannot survive. You don't need to fight the system. You just need to stop feeding it with unconscious compliance. When you choose silence on your terms, not theirs, that's freedom. When you choose peace without guilt, that's rebellion. And when you finally realize that every command you've ever obeyed was optional, that's awakening. Subscribe to the channel and don't stop at this video. They're still using tricks you haven't noticed yet. The next video will show you exactly how they do it, and once you see it, you'll never see people the same way again.